Our scripture this morning is from Exodus chapter 13. We'll be reading verses 17 and 18. Exodus chapter 13, reading verses 17 and 18. Exodus chapter 13, beginning verse 17. When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them on the road through the Philistine country, though that was shorter. For God said if they face war, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. So God led the people around by the desert road toward the Red Sea. The Israelites went up out of Egypt armed for battle. And this is the word of the Lord for us today. I wonder how many of us come to a point in our lives or have ever had that moment where you just pause for a time and it just hits you all of a sudden and you think to yourself, perhaps even say out loud, how did I get here? How did I end up in this place, in these circumstances? And sometimes when we ask those questions, it's because all of a sudden we realize that we're experiencing such great blessings that it could only come because the hand of God has been on us all this time. We haven't even realized what blessing God has been pouring out upon us. But God has been leading us, He's been blessing us, and we hadn't even known it. But we've been so caught up in the moment of it all, just trying to plug along, trying to obey His will, trying to do what God has asked us to do. We didn't even realize the magnitude of His love and His blessing in our lives until one day it just hits us. And we ask, how did I even get here? And then on the other hand, sometimes in our lives we get to that point asking those very same questions. How did I end up here in this place, in these circumstances? At every turn of life I seem to run into more and more trouble. With every decision that I make, it just seems to get worse and worse. And I seem to bury myself deeper and deeper into this hole. And perhaps eventually, maybe on our own, but more likely someone has to come alongside of us, a good friend perhaps, and lets us know that I've been living out of God's will. I hadn't been living quite right. And instead of being led by God's Spirit and allowing myself to follow in God's will, I've been trying to do things all on my own. And I've been fighting against God all this time. And I found myself in more and more trouble. And eventually I snap out of it, or someone snaps me out of it. And I realize, or I question, how did I end up here? And begin asking those questions. How did we get here? Where are we headed? Questions like these help us to realize that ultimately I am not the end-all, be-all of life, but there is something greater. There is a God, and I do matter to Him. And the question is, will we learn to trust God and trust that God has our best interest at heart, or will we continue to fight against Him? Will we learn to trust His will in our lives, or will we try to go about it on our own? As we look to the Scriptures this morning, we look back to the Israelites. They're about to leave Egypt here. And God has heard their cries for mercy as they've been enslaved for now hundreds of years. And God has sent Moses to confront Pharaoh to set the people free. And after stubbornly refusing to do so, God sends a series of plagues upon the land, eventually leading up to the 10th plague, the final plague, which was the death of all the firstborn children and animals throughout the land. And nothing was exempt from this plague unless you followed God's instructions. which were to apply the blood of a lamb on the sides and tops of the doorposts, of the doorframe. And that blood, you see, would become a sign for when the covering of blood was seen, that house was passed over. But for those that did not have that covering of blood, their firstborn was killed. And that included the house of Pharaoh. His firstborn would be one of the victims that night. And that was enough for Pharaoh to say, okay, I've had enough. You take these people, you and your God, leave us alone. Get out of here. Go worship as you say you want to worship. Go just leave us be. He had had enough of these people and their God. And so this night, on this particular night, the people set out to head out of Egypt. And remember, we're not talking about a band of 50 or 100 people here. No, we're told that this group of people leaving out of Egypt on this night consisted of 600,000 men, not including the women and children, and their flocks and their herds. And it says a great number of other people went with them, so that means some Egyptians joined in their traveling band, or perhaps other foreigners in the land that took up with their cause of wanting to leave Egypt as well. And so it's estimated that we're talking close to 2 million people take flight out of Egypt on this night. Now you think a group of 10 or 20 or 100 people has too many chiefs and not enough Indians. How about a group of 2 million? So do you think that every move that was made was second-guessed? Even when Moses first showed up here and began to confront Pharaoh, and it didn't go quite the way that the people wanted it to go, and they started to lash out at Moses, said, "What are you doing, man? You're making it, they're killing us. Get out of here, leave us alone. We had it so good in our bondage, in our slavery." Didn't even realize where they were. So just imagine here when it says that as they left Egypt on this night, and God didn't lead them on the road through the Philistine country, the short road, the short path, but the road by the sea. But if we're going to the land of Canaan, why are we not going on the road that goes to Canaan? Can't you just hear all the backseat drivers? Or I guess it would be the second row marchers, as it were. I can already hear the grumbling beginning in this group of 2 million people leaving out. But you know, the more I think about it and think of this group in all this rush to leave on this night, because remember, it's as we read through this story, it's a very much a quick preparing to leave. God says just to grab what you can and gird up your loins and be ready to go. I'm going to venture to guess that they were really unaware of truly what was taking place on this night. I'm betting that they were unaware that on this night they were truly being set free from their bondage. I'm betting that on this night perhaps they were just so caught up in the moment of gathering their family and gathering possessions and what little food they could carry that they give so little thought to what was taking place in their lives at this moment. So much so that it says that they're being led by this great pillar of cloud by day and fire by night. That it didn't register to them that something supernatural is taking place. It didn't occur to them that perhaps something more than just this crazy man named Moses is here who showed up doing some really neat tricks, but something more than that is guiding them out of Egypt. And so when he shows up here and he says, "I'm here to lead you out of Egypt to the land that God swore to our fathers," they had to be thinking on this night, well, that's great. We'll be there in just a few days. It's only a week's journey from here to there. That's awesome. But no sooner than we get up to leave from here and go to there that we head out on the wrong road. It's like we're saying we're going to leave from here and go to Gadsden, but we take off and go that way. What are you doing, Moses? You're crazy. We start to go out into the desert. But you see, God was guiding this journey. It tells us this pillar of cloud was guiding them. And they're so caught up in the moment they don't even realize what's going on. And God didn't take them straight to Canaan along the northern road, along the short path to get there. Why? Well, it tells us, you see, that God knew these folks. He knew what they had been through. And He knew, specifically right here, it says if they faced war, they would turn back and go to Egypt, the very place they had just been freed from. But you see, these people had been so beaten down, such a submissive role as slaves for so many, many years. And you know, when you're in such a role, it's strange, but for so many folks in that situation, oftentimes the victim in that situation feels a bit of sense of security in that role, because they know what to expect. I know that if I behave in such a way that I'll be left alone, but if I act in this way, that I could expect punishment. So there is a way, even in slavery, even in an abusive situation, there's a sense of normalcy. And so when you first leave that, when you're first freed from that, it's strange and it's uneasy. You've just left what you've known all your life. And in this case, they've only known someone lording over them. But you know what? It sure beats somebody coming at you with a sword, ready to kill you in battle. And God knew that, see? So He wasn't ready to... He knew that they wouldn't be ready to face people trying to kill them. They wouldn't be ready for war just yet. They would be eventually, but it would take time to get there. So even though we're supposed to be heading toward the Promised Land, God leads the folks the long way there instead of the short way. Because you see, the short way was full of dangers that the people didn't even know about. The short way was full of danger the people didn't even know was there, that they would even face on the short road. There were enemies there that they were not ready to face. Sometimes there's enemies in front of us or awaiting us that we don't even know exist yet. But God may be leading us on a different path to avoid those enemies. But we get in such a hurry to rush ahead of God that we run right through all of God's watches and warnings, and we run straight headlong into those enemies, don't we? Now, sure, this long path that God led them on, it had its share of difficulties too, didn't it? It had its share of trials, including a big one coming up immediately. When it looked as if there was no way out, there was a big sea that they encountered in front of them. They ran into this big wall of water and they looked behind them and there's an Egyptian army coming at them. Now what do we do? But what did it leave them to do? What were they reminded of with this pillar of cloud in front of them? That pillar, you see, it says it moved from in front of them to behind them, and it put a separation between them and the enemy. And it kept them safe until the Lord and the Lord alone provided a way out. And that way out was right through the middle of the sea. And He parted those waters. But you see, they had to learn to trust the Lord for their deliverance. They had to begin to learn to trust God. Through this whole experience, beginning when they first cried out to God in their misery, to when God sent Moses on the scene, to hear when God is leading them out, but not the way they might have expected to go. Through it all, they had to start to learn to trust God. Learning to trust that God had their best interest at heart, even when they didn't understand what was going on or what He was doing, God was in control. And they had to learn to trust in Him. And in the course of the long way around, they had to learn to trust. They learned who God was in that long path. And they learned in that long path why He cared for them so. And not only that they learned who they were in relation to Him. For you see, they were called a holy nation, a holy people. They learned a lot on this long path. If we'd have just got there in 5 days, they wouldn't have learned anything. You know, there's times in our lives when we may not understand how we got to where we are, maybe not even know where we're going. But we've got to learn to trust that the Lord is leading us and guiding us to bring us where He wants us to be safely and securely. But what happens when we try to go it alone? When we try to take the short path on our own, we often run into those dangers we never even knew were there, that often would have been avoided if we stuck to God's will, to God's plan in our lives. This is what the Israelites come to find out here in the wilderness. When they stick to God's will, when they stick to God's timing, it works out well for them every time. But when they try to go it alone, when they try to do it their own way, when they try to take shortcuts and quick routes to where they think they ought to be, what's it end up in? Nothing but hardships and failures time and time again. Folks, we have to learn to trust the Lord. Learn to trust that He has our best interests at heart. Learn to trust that even when we find ourselves in peculiar circumstances, that maybe we're right where God wants us to be. But we also have to realize that God works to keep us from harm as well. And so often we try to rush ahead of Him that we might run right into dangers that He's tried so hard to protect us from. So let us learn to trust God, to wait upon the Lord, to follow His guidance and to His will for our lives. And when we are in God's will, we are indeed learning to be a holy people as well. As we sing our closing hymn this morning, perhaps you've been in a place where you've had a hard time learning to trust. You've rushed ahead of the Lord time and time again. Maybe it's time to slow down and get back on the right path, to get back in God's will, to get back in the safety and security of His arms. He's there waiting for you. Would you let Him lead you? Would you learn to trust Him this day? Would you come as we sing?